we'll give it a few minutes to let everyone get in. I like that you can see the background. Good. Hi, Debbie. All right, so I guess we'll get started. So thank you all for coming to UTA's virtual film screening. I'm Kristen Copper, Community Engagement Coordinator at UTA and the director of this documentary. And I have with me Laura Feltz, Co-Executive Director at UTA. And you'll see at the top of the chat box, I've left a couple of links. So the first link will bring you to UTA's website to make a donation if you'd like to help support UTA's work. UTA appreciates donations, and there's no contribution too small. Contributions help UTA prevent evictions and homelessness and protect tenants' rights to safe, decent, and affordable housing. In case anyone is interested in learning more about the Housing Justice for All Coalition or the Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester, I've left the links to their websites in the chat as well. All right, so I think we'll get started answering questions, and I see a bunch of comments getting left here too. So one question I saw in the previous chat box was, what's going on with the courts right now, Laura? Are evictions happening this month?
So at this point, the implementation period for the New York State eviction moratorium expired at the end of February. So any tenants who haven't provided one of those verifications to their landlords can be sued right now. So we do have court appearances and court hearings happening. Tenants do have the opportunity to provide a verification once again at that point when they appear, but we are seeing tenants don't know their rights. They don't always know about using those tools, and so tenants are being sued and tenants are unfortunately being evicted right now.
Okay. I saw another question. What was the hardest part of filming during a pandemic? So it's definitely difficult to make a film during COVID for sure. I ran into a lot of times that people I was supposed to interview or myself were going in and out of quarantine. There were so many cases of COVID going around the area during the time I was trying to film. So it was a little difficult because you would schedule some interviews and then find out someone needed to get tested or they were in quarantine. So there was a lot of rescheduling happening. Let's take a look. Can you speak to the new funds for housing passed with the new state budget? There was some eviction protections within that.
Yeah, the budget was interesting. Some quick, exciting things about the budget are that some really important programs were fully funded, including the Neighborhood Preservation Program and the Homeowner Protection Program. So there will be services in place for folks when things start to get crazy. In terms of rent relief, we did not win what we believed and still believe is really the appropriate solution for what tenants need. That the policy solution that would have mitigated and really dealt with rent arrears debt in a comprehensive way. So we have another emergency rent relief program that's being rolled out by the state. We are hoping and praying that it's more effective than the one that we've been subjected to for the past year, which has reached all of 1% of those tenants that are behind on their rent. We've interfaced with somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 tenants who are behind on their rent, and we don't know a single person who's received money from that program. So fingers crossed that this works a little bit better. So we have $2.3 billion in federal money plus $100 million in state money that's moving towards that emergency rent assistance program in the state. The most recent estimates of back rent, which have come out now since Kristen finished her awesome film, are up towards $3.5 billion now of rent arrears in New York State alone. So it's a lot of money that's owed. Unfortunately, the rent relief program that we have now that just passed does still put a lot of burden on tenants to have to prove that they have in fact been experiencing hardships and that they are behind on their rent and it's not their fault and that they're actually in need of relief. However, there are some positive things about this that we fought for and won. So some tenants will be able to provide attestations, so be able to give their word that they've been through this, that they've been through the pandemic, lost their job, had financial hardships, and be able to hopefully access relief that way. And there's some eviction protections tied to landlords receiving that money, which is something we're really excited that we won. So any landlord who receives the rent relief funds, which they also cannot be refused. So when a tenant's approved for this funding and the landlord receives it, the tenant's protected from a rent increase for at least 1 year and has the right to renew their lease for a year. So it's good cause eviction protections tied to the funding.
Okay, let's check out. I saw some more questions getting listed here. And actually, someone asked a question I had been wondering about earlier. So can you talk about the impact of this CDC moratorium? So does the federal moratorium affect what's going on here in New York State?
Yeah, so far, every eviction protection that New York State has put out has been sort of stronger than the CDC moratorium. We're also seeing some freaky stuff happening around the country where the legitimacy of that moratorium is being overturned. That hasn't happened in New York State at this point. So that moratorium brings us technically through June. It requires that tenants fill out a different hardship that's connected to the CDC and send that to their landlord and give that over to the court. Some problems with that moratorium that have been ongoing. Landlords have still the explicit right to contest the verification, sue the tenant. So you don't see a lot of meaningful protection from that particular eviction protection. You haven't since the beginning of the pandemic, and it's continued to not be very strong.
Are the landlords who have done illegal and felonious actions been charged?
That's a great question and a huge problem. Thank you for asking. We have a lot of people reach out on our hotline who are experiencing behavior from their landlords that's definitely criminal. That's criminalized in property laws, and then is just a regular old criminal not having to do with a landlord-tenant relationship. And it's really common that police they say it's a civil issue, it's between a landlord and a tenant, and so we won't get involved. We do a lot of work at United Tenants to train the police and to intervene in those situations, to have landlords be held accountable to those kinds of behaviors. We've had some successful cases in landlords being held accountable. There's been a few arrests of landlords who've illegally locked out tenants, thrown their belongings out, forced them out of their apartment in the middle of the pandemic. But also we've seen other landlords board up the door of a tenant's apartment and only let them back in when we went to the press. So it's definitely been challenging. And I'm sure, unfortunately, people may have seen an article where a landlord in Albany kidnapped his tenants, tied them up, and left them in a graveyard. And thank goodness, ultimately they were, survived and probably aren't okay, but weren't horribly, terribly hurt. And so there's a lot of egregious behaviors happening that, are not being taken seriously enough by law enforcement.
And we saw some of that in the film. One of the tenants dealt with a landlord who was threatening her using a hammer. That's scary. So,
and when you think about how in the film you see how the police reacted to a community intervening to try to save a woman's home, and how that warranted riot police pulling everyone off the scene and arresting all of them, and yet then you have Marie and the folks who call our hotline who feel like their personal safety is really being threatened, not just their asset, their investment property, and they can't get they don't get protected. So.
All right, some other questions. What are some ways community members can get involved with UTA and help prevent evictions, advocate for relief? So I think for me, one thing that comes to mind is if you joined our mailing list. I often send out call to actions, which tell community members ways that they can get involved and help with the different things that are going on. So if you go to our website, utalbany.org, you'll see where you can join our mailing list. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Does anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, we also have opportunities for volunteers to help out on our hotline. So for anybody who's directly interested in getting in the trenches and hanging out with our amazing superstar Livette, who you met on our film, You can, we have volunteers working on our hotline pretty much every day. And so we always need help. As you could see, our calls are all over the place. And then we have our awesome organizer, Adrian, who is always open to taking on volunteers who want to help him with door knocking, canvassing, phone banking, again, for anybody who wants to help us in the trenches.
What policies do you find most effective as you work toward housing for all?
Oh, I love that question. Of course, that came from Eileen Spath. You're a treasure, Eileen. Oh my gosh, there's so many. Where do we start? I think right now in COVID, we've been saying, cancel rent for over a year now. And it's not to say that we want to see, that we don't want to see relief. So we're talking about mitigating rent and mortgage arrears debt, because those numbers are enormous, and then establishing hardship funds so that folks who then are still suffering, who still have lost income to the extent where you're not just looking at an impact to profit margins, but an impact actually to somebody's life, that then they can access hardship funds, so that we're not putting the burden of seeking help on people who can't even afford to put food on their table and are not really able to access relief and jump through the hoops that they're being asked to jump through. We could talk about a lot of other policies. I'd probably have everybody on this for an hour, but a great place to learn about some of the advocacy issues that we're really focused on in New York State is to go to the Housing Justice for All website that Kristen dropped in there. And you can learn more about, like, good cause eviction is extremely important and something we're also fighting for locally. Better code enforcement is so important and also a big part of our local fight. And rent control, things that will bring us closer to tenants having control over safe, decent, and affordable housing.
All right. Are there any other questions people have? You can feel free to leave it in the box. I actually have a question for you, if you don't mind me asking and putting you on the spot a little bit. But I'm just thinking, I started working at United Tenants during COVID. So I'm wondering, there was always housing issues before the COVID pandemic, but in your opinion, what are some housing issues you've seen really exacerbated or become really obvious because of COVID?
Yeah.
Like, one thing that comes to mind for me a lot is it's become how obvious that a lot of people are paycheck to paycheck and how easy it is to fall behind on paying your rent. And I think COVID has made that really obvious. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you think of any other.
Yeah, people living without a safety net is huge. That was the biggest issue that we saw before COVID. And now, during seeing how people who lost their jobs fell behind, now some people a year, they haven't paid their rent in a year, and they could not even begin to consider making ends meet. So that's huge. And also the things that we see that are so problematic are the substandard housing conditions. So as soon as those shelter in place orders happened, our calls to our hotline spiked, and not just around like, I've lost my job, but I'm trapped in my housing and it's toxic. I have mold, I have lead, and being in my housing all day long is making me sick. My heat doesn't work. My job was warm. And so being at my job all day helped me cope with my housing conditions. And now I'm stuck here. People were really trapped, and then their kids were trapped. So where their kids were often gone all day, and so whatever substandard housing conditions they had, they were sort of able to separate. It became like inescapable, and people were really trapped. And the right to get repairs, the rights that tenants have to seek repairs are just not enough.
John asks, any exploration of connecting with landlords to jointly push back on mortgage servicing companies and the legislator for joint protections?
That's a great question. So when you really take a hard look at the rent relief bill that we have been fighting for since the beginning of the crisis, that is the policy measure that pushes the burden up to the banks. So I love that question, because when you cancel rent or you mitigate rent arrears debt and then you mitigate mortgage arrears debt, society's making a collective decision that the people aren't going to be the victim, and that we're going to push the burden up where it can be sustained to the banks. So we have done a lot in our statewide movement to try to connect that narrative to say this is good for tenants, homeowners, and small landlords, that non-corporate landlords, because that policy measure really takes the burden off of all of those folks and puts it onto entities that are only facing a loss of profit margins, like huge corporate landlords and banks, mortgage lenders.
All right. Any other questions for us? I think we got all of them here, I want to say. Keep from missing about and crash the banking system.
I don't know what that means, but I'm going to Google it.
Was there anything you couldn't include in the film that you want to say? Oh, that's a good question. I think I just wish I was able to interview more tenants, but that was just something that was very difficult during COVID. You know, people are staying home, we're not really connecting in person. So I'm definitely, holding out hope that I'm going to be able to make another film in the future. And I definitely want to have more involvement with tenants sharing their stories and have that be even more of a focus. Again, it was difficult during COVID to be able to always connect in person with people. So hopefully things will get a little bit better with the pandemic, and then I can make another film and it'll be a little easier to have even more people involved in it.
I would agree with that. Just that we wish we could have had more tenants really. Kristen had set up interviews with a number of other tenants and it just never came together because it is too much with the pandemic.
Any other questions? If not, we'll sign off. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming to our virtual screening. I hope everyone enjoyed the film.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Oh, it will be important to hear from tenants on the other end. Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
Good night.